After a long journey, the carriage arrived at the fortress. The man inside asked to open the gates. Since he was bringing her, the protagonist looked out the window, and in an instant, her bright pink eyes filled with wonder and surprise. Upon seeing the enormous fortress, they immediately opened the gates to the Duke's Phoenix fortress. The young girl had been told that it was always winter in the north, but inside the estate, defying the harsh cold, it was surprisingly green, and Yuna even was amazed by the powers of the magical stones. The uncle informed the protagonist that this was now her new home. From today, she was the Archduke's wife. As soon as Yuna stepped out of the carriage, the maids who received her began to whisper among themselves without even trying to hide it. The uncle's hand rested on his niece's shoulder. He explained that the people from the north tend to be cold toward strangers. In the island Rue, where the protagonist came from, there was no nation. But for her tribe, she would give everything. She took off her hood and introduced herself with a smile. The maids were stunned by her angelic beauty. Suddenly, a male voice nearby asked if that was his wife, and everyone jumped at the sight of his lordship, the Phoenix Duke. Bloodied, he explained that he had just come back from hunting and extended his bloodied hand towards the young girl. As soon as the man introduced himself, the protagonist shyly shook his hand, which surprisingly was very warm and big. Although the man's speech was quite cold, Yuna didn't mind it at all. The lord dropped the bombshell. No official wedding ceremony. The protagonist was stunned. Teo confessed to 3 wives in total, and the wives were either runaway or pushing up daisies shortly afterward. The Lord's secretary indicated where she would reside separate quarters from Teo, according to Ulysses, to acclimate slowly to the place. But bam! The girl's room was in the attic of the tower, and the rest of the floors were completely deserted. The protagonist, caught between shock and ecstasy, couldn't believe she would live alone in such a place. Lord Phoenix handing over the flask in his office, Ulysses arrived and reported that the girl was settled in the North Tower, but she was gnawed by doubt. Why was her lord covered in blood if there was no hunt? Teo explained that this was a kind of warning. He made it clear that there would be no marital harmony, and now she would stay quiet as a mouse. Without leaving her dusty attic upon hearing this, Ulysses decided to call David. With a smile, the lord asked if she had cried upon learning about the attic, but the advisors reported that she was smiling. Teo's eyes widened suddenly, and he stopped drinking as he didn't expect those words from Ulysses. The protagonist was delighted. She was happy to have such a large personal space. Moreover, thanks to the magical stones, the room was quite warm. It even warmed her icy hands for a few minutes. She hoped that now her tribe mates could also live in comfort. The beautiful lady reminisced about her days of old. Her father exclaimed indignantly that she couldn't marry a man she had never even seen in her life. However, the cold was intensifying on the island, and its people had never known winter. Therefore, the young woman had already made all her decisions. In Rue, eternal spring reigned. But when the island was suddenly hit by a wave of severe frost, its inhabitants panicked. Until now, the magical stones had not been necessary. The emperor's proposal to marry the Archduke, and in return receive a bunch of magical stones, became the last hope of the inhabitants of Rouge. But the father stood firm, for Yuna was his only heir. However, the heroine precisely considered the protection of her people. As the main task of an heir, time and time again, the protagonist reminded herself that she would make it. She didn't forget that she had her Uncle Delkin and Lord Ellis's secretary seemed like a good dude. Suddenly, the protagonist recalled the Archduke's hands in Rouen. The hunters were the most respected caste, almost like gods. Plus, the prota had to live a year in the attic, but Yuna thought it was great. To meet her husband, she had a feeling they would get along wonderfully. The beauty was so happy that without meaning to, she hit the magical stone. They started falling instantly. The young woman was terrified. She tried to catch them so they wouldn't break, but she lost a bit of control. The girl stumbled against the door that swung open. The protagonist fell to the ground and realized it was a secret passage she had never seen before. The fall hurt a little. The truth. Suddenly, a voice asked what she was doing there. The protagonist was stunned to see her husband, already dressed nicely. Looking at her in surprise, Teo was speechless for a few seconds. Yuna tried to explain that she was just trying to catch a stone. But the man didn't understand what was wrong with this girl because she should be in the attic right now crying. But instead, she decided to introduce herself again. The heroine said she really hoped they would get along. For some reason, the Archduke seemed to see his new wife's face in a new way, and he couldn't even take his eyes off her. He didn't understand why he hadn't looked at her properly during their first meeting, but he instantly caught that floral scent. Teo assumed it could be the perfume of that beautiful girl and began to examine her closely. Right now, she was petite and delicate. Her eyelashes looked like bird feathers, and her eyes were like 2 precious gems. And only then did Teo realize he was thinking something strange. He immediately mentally ordered himself to snap out of it. Teo shouldn't feel anything for her because weakness was unforgivable. Therefore, he couldn't love that girl. Thus, he needed to become even colder and tougher. The man decided to shout at her and send her back to the attic. He was going to do it. But when he noticed Yuna shivering from the cold, he instantly forgot all the words he had in his head. Instead, Teo asked why she was dressed so lightly. He immediately realized his mistake. The emissary of the goddess Daphne was the only soul on the planet, worthy of her powerful sacred power, but in reality she was just an invention. Or rather, that's what everyone believed, until they found a way to steal her power. 2 months ago, Archduke Phoenix asked his loyal advisor if that letter had come into his hands by mere chance. It spoke of a saint with a red mark who could be sacrificed in a year to seize the power of the saint. It was necessary to possess the mark. Mateo was the only one in the imperial family who had not yet received the mark. For royalty, marriage was a sacred bond, and the mark was obtained only once. Just a year after the wedding, the mark was for life, so choosing a partner was a very serious matter. But all the former fiancés of the lord either fled or died. The third candidate, the Archduke's wife, was successfully eliminated, and now the preparations to obtain the mark were complete. To be precise, the emperor got rid of all of them. The Archduke was the emperor's nephew on his mother's side. They called him the demon of war and beast, who went insane on the battlefield, causing absolute terror around him. At 15, Teo buried his mother and went to the battlefield for the first time since then. Fear became a luxury he couldn't afford. If he showed weakness even for a moment, he would fall, and with him the north would fall, along with all its inhabitants, into a grave with his enemies. Teo buried his emotions, but this caused his own people to start avoiding him. Every wife of the man fled, risking their lives rather than live with a monster, or ended up dead, but still Teo felt no sadness. He simply let time pass, and the days turned into years. The advisor reported that they urgently needed a plan. Because they couldn't allow the emperor to do as he pleased, Teo simply decided to marry her. Ulysses asked indignantly how he would marry a woman who would be sacrificed in a year. Teo coldly replied that the emperor wouldn't dare touch her, but he needed to obtain the mark from her. Doubt gnawed at the Archduke. What would the great emperor say if the mark appeared? And now there she was in front of his brand new wife. Teo mentally prepared to give her a good scare. But surprised, the young woman innocently asked if he wasn't cold. The lord coldly replied that the cold didn't affect him at all. However, a look of fascination lit up Yuna's face. She looked away embarrassed upon noticing how revealing her outfit was. And Teo didn't understand her reaction, but soon realized that his plan had worked perfectly. Teo told her that crossing the bridge would lead to her private terrace, and warned her that if she wanted to go anywhere, she had to ask for his permission since she couldn't move without his authorization. Plus, Uncle decided to intimidate her a bit. With a serious tone, he told her he could even catch a shiny white squirrel. The protagonist was surprised to learn that only a few steps separated the attic from her lord's quarters. Suddenly, in this recap manhwa, a strong gust of wind blew, and all of a sudden, Yuna began to lose her balance. The man's hand, almost instinctively, reached out to her instantly. The protagonist was very close to her husband, and her face lit up from the proximity. She froze, staring at him intently. A slight blush also appeared on Teo's face. It seemed like the young girl weighed nothing, like a feather, and her figure had a delicate silhouette. It was as if he was holding a little bird in his hand. Yuna quietly called out to her lord. The Archduke hurriedly withdrew his hand from the young girl, assuming she simply disliked his touches. The previous wives trembled at just a touch, but unexpectedly Yuna thanked him. For the ex-wives, his subjects, and the enemy soldiers, the Northern Archduke has always been, and will forever be, nothing but embodied terror. But there wasn't a hint of fear in Yuna's eyes. Teo suddenly wondered what the point was of trying to seem terrifying. Besides, Teo could give her everything this beautiful young woman desired, so if he offered her something valuable, Yuna wouldn't be able to escape. He asked the protagonist if she needed magic stones. Yuna understood that the Archduke knew why she had married him, but surely he wouldn't like the protagonist reminding him now that this marriage was purely for convenience. Therefore, Yuna replied that she didn't have to hand them over right now. Teo was surprised, but asked what she wanted. Then he immediately noticed how the young girl's expression changed, and how after her words she started to reflect on something. It wasn't clear what words were about to come out of those lips, maybe. Now she would ask him to let her go back home. However, whatever she said, this girl was surely in for a disappointment, because Teo wasn't going to let her go anywhere. Yuna suggested having breakfast together, but he unconsciously refused. As soon as Teo understood the meaning of the words, he asked what she had just said. The protagonist, with a wide and sincere smile, proposed again to her lord to have breakfast together. She wasn't asking for gems or money. It was just a shared breakfast, but Teo didn't understand what such a small squirrel could eat for breakfast. So he thought about going to the forest for acorns. Suddenly, Yuna began to apologize for it. The Archduke had been silent for too long, so the heroine acted. She only hoped for some light conversation at breakfast that would help them get to know each other better. And then suddenly Teo accepted, however. He thought it would be better to have lunch. The advisor was furious because he had been woken up so early. He didn't understand why his lordship urgently needed to replace the kitchen chef right at dawn. So Yuli assumed it was all because of the Archduchess. Teo reminded him that Yuna is now his wife. They need to share a table every once in a while. Yuli felt that Lord had taken an interest in that girl. Maybe now the master could live a normal life. The advisor wanted to help, and suggested that his lordship send the Count of the Dog to the northern wall to solve the refugee problem. That would take 3 whole months. And that means Yuna won't have contact with him during that entire time. The protagonist was surprised to learn from her uncle that by her husband's order, she had to head to the northern wall. Before leaving, Delkin wanted to discuss something. He asked his niece if they had consummated the marriage. The uncle bluntly asked if she spent the night with the Archduke, and made the protagonist blush instantly. Delkin was furious to learn that nothing had happened yet. With that face, he could have dragged Lord to bed long ago. He should be guiding his niece. But instead, he had to go to the northern wall for some refugees. That's why he told Yuna that he didn't like her husband if they hadn't consummated the marriage. She had to seduce him immediately. Delkin suggested she wear something provocative, something any man would want to rip off her in an instant. Suddenly, a strange noise was heard. Yuna was left wondering what the hell that was. Her uncle reminded her to remember his advice, and with the promise that she understood, the protagonist went out to the large terrace. A nearby voice warned her that she would freeze soon. The Archduke threw his coat over the heroine. He explained to the young woman that if she caught a cold, it would cause an unnecessary problem, and that had to be avoided. Blushing, Yuna thanked the man, but the coat was big, and Teo decided to cut the sleeves with his sword. The protagonist immediately replied that she would just fold them and everything would be fine, that something good shouldn't be ruined. Teo held back a smile and asked if she had seen Delkin. Yuna nodded and mentioned that he was leaving for work matters, but in reality, Teo was aware of everything they talked about, because from the hallway he could hear perfectly well. Come on. He casually overheard the whole conversation if Delkin wasn't. Teo said she could go to him for everything, but for some reason the girl felt embarrassed. Delkin explained to her that she just had to please him, and then the magic stones would flow into her hands suddenly. Yuna's stomach growled loudly. The main protagonist immediately began to apologize. She usually always had breakfast, but today she couldn't do it and hadn't eaten since yesterday. Teo's face turned red. Instantly. This girl was too adorable. Shortly after, the Northern Archduke was already sitting in his office surrounded by imaginary birds, meditating on something his subordinates didn't understand why he admired his fingers. Teo's personal physiotherapist. David was excited because the Lord had called him for the first time. He had served as a field doctor there. The hero checked many times that soul wounds are harder to heal than physical ones. His Lord's wounds were very serious, because the Lord was indifferent to everything, as if he had no emotions. So it must be something serious now. David asked about the severity of the symptoms, and Teo replied that it was serious. The personal physiotherapist's eyes lit up. He asked his lord to describe his current state in more detail with a confident tone. Teo reported that he had been cursed. Confusion appeared on the faces of the subordinates. They didn't understand who had dared to curse the Archduke. And the dark-haired man explained that he was taming someone. Teo explained that it was a long-tailed collie. It was very small and adorable, but the powerful Archduke of the North was convinced that this little creature had enchanted him. David asked what made him suspect a curse. Teo slammed the table and exclaimed that he couldn't stop wanting to see it. He desperately wanted to keep it in his pocket and take it everywhere to admire its heavenly beauty. Silence flooded the room. David didn't expect to hear a story about a collie, but it must be said that for the first time in a long time his lord showed emotions, so there was a clear improvement. David confidently exclaimed that yes, he was cursed. Under normal circumstances, he would have prescribed a special magic antidote that would eliminate all magical effects. But first, the little bird needs to be shown to someone else. If the bird is enchanted, the charm magic will also affect others. If the Archduke himself understands that the tenderness is not caused by magic, it will be easier for him to recognize the change in his own character. Teo communicated to David that this was his first recommendation. Really useful. The physiotherapist was glad to hear compliments directed at him. He left the room, and then the advisor asked his lord if he really believed that Yuna was using magic. Ulysses would have succumbed then to the effects of the symptoms, but they will discover the truth when they follow David's advice. The day of the hunt was approaching, and all those damn rich people would gather in one place. They are the ones who can be shown to Her Highness the Archduchess of the North. All the preparation fell on Julius. Teo also asked him to ensure that Yuna was well wrapped up. The advisor suddenly felt uncomfortable and assured his lord that he would supervise him. A couple of days later, Yuli went out onto the street with Yuna. He immediately noticed the girl's red hands and suggested that she put on gloves. They had almost arrived at the cabin where the aristocrats gather once a month to hunt with the Archduke. Today was the first hunt, and Yuna still didn't know all the local etiquette rules well. The advisor mentioned that this river hadn't frozen yet, and that when it did, they could skate on it, but Yuna didn't know what that was, and Yuli's promised to get a pair just for her as they approached the little house, and the advisor opened the door for the girl. Inside, Yuna immediately noticed the presence of several men, one of whom approached the protagonist and said, enthusiastically, that she was truly beautiful, and that the servants weren't lying. Most likely, the Archduke would be very pleased. Ulysses asked the gentlemen not to forget their manners, but they didn't understand what they had said wrong. After all, the girl was really beautiful, so there was nothing indecent in their words. They knew she had been sold in exchange for magic stones. That's why they started offering the young woman their own magic stones. The protagonist clenched her fist, because it was unpleasant to hear those words directed at her. Ulysses indignantly asked what kind of things they were saying. The Archduke coldly asked what the hell they were doing there, and the aristocrats were instantly scared upon seeing the furious face of the Northern Archduke on the second floor, and asked how long he had been there. Teo ordered Ulysses to take the girl to the second floor. The aristocrat, with a confused voice, suggested to his lord that they leave. But the Archduke coldly announced his cancellation. Then he roughly grabbed the insolent one by the neck and lifted him with one hand. Teo promised him he wouldn't come out unscathed from this. The Archduke tightly grasped the aristocrat's hand and asked if he had accumulated so many magic stones. Did he have more than the Northern Archduke? Immediately after he threw the poor guy to the ground. Teo coldly ordered them to listen attentively. At that moment, they now had to leave quietly or sacrifice the hidden gems to the Empire to keep their limbs. The Archduke ordered that anyone who dared to tarnish the honor of the Archduchess would lose their life immediately. The aristocrats, seized by panic, fled at once. The protagonist was sitting on the couch waiting for her husband. She had never been humiliated like that before. Suddenly, the young woman heard a noise downstairs and began to worry that the Archduke might be in trouble because of her. But just then the man opened the door. Yuna was surprised to see him. He saw how she was treated by the other aristocrats. So now, Teo surely wouldn't consider her fit to be his wife. The man knelt before the girl and asked her to give him her hand. Confusion reflected on Yuna's face. The Archduke explained that he thought he saw a wound on her hand. Yuna looked at it in surprise. Indeed, her hand had red marks from her nails. Teo applied a balm made from crushed healing stones. And everything healed quickly, asking with concern if it hurt a lot. Instead of answering his question, the Archduke listened to his wife apologize for offending him because of her. Important people attended this hunt, and maintaining good relationships with them is crucial, so the protagonist was very worried. But Teo asked her to remember that in these lands only he is above the Archduchess in her domains. She could do whatever she wanted. Matteo was the lord of these lands, and she was his lady. The protagonist was left thinking about her husband's words. He was right, after all. She shouldn't fear anything thanks to her status as the Archduchess of the North, but the unease persisted. Her lord was her husband. She withdrew her hand as that thought made her uncomfortable due to the girl's action. The man assumed that the idea of having to stay there for life was surely overwhelming her. Yuna asked if he was going hunting now as she unbuttoned her cape. She explained that Yulis had gotten her a hunting outfit. Teo froze, instantly unable to articulate a word. This beautiful outfit was specially made for the occasion, so it would be a shame not to wear it. Until now, he'd only seen her in baggy dresses. At that moment, Teo thought she seemed so fragile, and he mentally slapped himself. Realizing what he was thinking, he ordered himself to compose himself. Yuna asked if she looked that strange. Teo denied her assumptions and asked if she had ever hunted. The girl nodded. She excitedly recounted that she even knew how to use a slingshot, but she had never managed to catch anything. She was like an adorable creature. Teo extended his hand and suggested they just take a walk in the woods. The protagonist took his hand and, with a warm smile, she replied to the Archduke that it was a wonderful idea. And that's how our protagonist did it. There were many flowers, but none had any scent because they were grown with magical stones, artificial flowers without scent. Yuna suggested changing course, to look for another place. The scent of her hair seemed intoxicating to our hero. While she admired flowers, Teo thought it might be good that they didn't smell. A spell or not, it didn't really matter. The Archduchess was simply beautiful. End of discussion. Suddenly she suggested skating. Although she had no idea what that was, Teo explained that they were boots with blades underneath. But he was worried about the harsh climate to which Yuna was not accustomed. With a radiant smile, she asked, "Will you teach me to skate and use a sled?" If she wanted, of course he could do it. Suddenly he noticed her reddened hands and mentally cursed. He should have brought her something warm to cover up. Yuna took some gloves out of her pocket and explained that Yuli had given them to her. They were a bit big, but at least her hands were very warm with them. Then the protagonist. She started talking about how nice Yulis was to her and how attentive Teo was, frowning instantly. It must be the same Yulis who kicked so many lords out of the council. That guy was capable of using the dirtiest and craftiest tricks to win the war, without stopping at anything. Yulis constantly annoyed Teo with his sermons. And for some reason, Yuna considered him nice and attentive. Teo felt a chill down his neck. A tremor ran through him, and he felt uneasy, but he assumed it was just a draft. Teo understood it was all because of the gift. The protagonist wanted to gift her something, so she would see him as nice and attentive, but nothing worked. The man was racking his brains thinking about what to give her. He was sure he had something suitable on hand. Teo saw a red jewelry box, and upon opening it, he discovered a pair of earrings with a large ruby. At that moment, Yuli walked into the office. He told him that he had taken care of the lords who stood out during the hunt, noticing his master's fixed gaze. The advisor asked if something was wrong, but in this recap manhwa, the Archduke from the North replied that he had no doubt that a man so good and attentive did everything right. Yulis understood it was all because of the gloves. He suggested to his master to give something to the girl, and instantly noticed his mother's earrings. The advisor pleaded for him to reconsider that decision, but Teo responded that the girl wouldn't leave and those earrings were much more valuable than some simple fabric gloves. Yuli knew he wouldn't convince that stubborn blockhead. The Archduke stood up from the table, determined to deliver the gift right now. He approached the shelf and ordered his good and attentive advisor to leave and stop being a nuisance. Yuli smiled as if his master had been given back his life. Teo carried the gift with a radiant smile as he reached Yuna's door. He knocked immediately. The young woman asked him to wait a second, and Teo anxiously waited for her to come out. But when she did, he was left frozen. Yuna was wearing a very revealing outfit just seeing her. The Archduke felt a sudden heat and didn't understand what kind of magic that was. The girl began to cover herself with her hands, thinking he was the maid. Teo declared that from now on, he only wanted to see her in that pajamas. Although he only thought it, he didn't say it out loud. Teo explained that he came to deliver something, but since it wasn't a good time, he promised to come back later. But Yuna grabbed his hand and begged him to stay. She responded that she didn't feel uncomfortable at all. The man understood it was a terrible curse that controlled her body. In that room, everything was Yuna's, and Teo told her she could take whatever she wanted. In that robe, she looked like a delicate cotton candy flake. Teo handed her a small jewelry box, and the protagonist's face filled with surprise upon opening it and seeing its contents. The girl, confused, asked if he really gave her that, and he felt a bit embarrassed. But Yuna had no idea what to wish for. She was genuinely happy with the gift. Hardly had Yuna thanked the man. A warm smile appeared on the protagonist's face when she saw him so happy. He was glad she liked it. The protagonist was surprised, thinking about something. If she and the Archduke kept getting closer, maybe one day they would be a normal couple and live happily. Yuna wished that would happen soon. A week later, they were having lunch together. The protagonist's personal maid named Ray let out a heavy sigh at the age of 12. She went to war in place of her sick older brother to defend the country and her family's honor. The other knights constantly mocked her, but the Archduke personally offered to teach her how to wield a sword. In the end, Ray helped the man win the war and was named honorary knight of the great empire. But she sadly realized her lord was incapable of feeling joy. Ray decided to retire and follow him to the castle. She was going to dedicate her life to serving her family, but her lord had already lost 3 wives. And she began to get nervous even though the new lady had a truly kind heart. With a woman like that by his side, her lord could find happiness. Ray thought that, but she was furious, because today the Northern Archduke seemed very upset. Yuna loved the beautiful garden and asked the man what his favorite flowers were, but he, showing no emotion, replied that he didn't like flowers, which made Ray even angrier. Yuna suggested having tea, but Teo said he would ask to be taken to his office. Sadness immediately appeared on the girl's face. The advisor looked closely at the Archduchess, and noticing her ears without earrings, assumed her ladyship was upset about that. He whispered to Ray that he had an idea. The girl proposed shock therapy, but the advisor replied that they should first remove her ladyship. Ray quickly invented a false excuse to ask her ladyship to step away. Teo stood up and informed Yuna that he would be absent for a moment. Yuli approached the girl and asked for permission to ask her a personal question. The protagonist, of course, agreed, and then the advisor asked if her ladyship had given her something expensive the night before. She nodded, and the man revealed that those earrings had been worn by the late Archduchess. Now the jewels were just a memory of her mother. It was very valuable to the Archduke. The protagonist understood her crucial mistake, and she asked the advisor what to do in this complicated situation. In reality, she had a reason. Ray was following her lord. Teo asked the maid if she planned to stab him in the back because it showed on her face. She asked indignantly, why was he so distant with the lady? Had she upset him in some way? But the man, with dark hair, immediately replied that it wasn't that, and it was probably him who didn't please the Archduchess. But not many people like cold people. Teo asked if the lady had ever mentioned those earrings. Rael asked the man if he was referring to the ruby earrings of his late mother. Now he understood the reason for the lord's bad mood, but it wasn't worth getting offended over. Ray suggested that the lady kept the valuable jewel for a special occasion, so the man should apologize suddenly. Yuna caught up with them. Trying to catch her breath, she told them she needed to say something. Yuna extended a jewelry box and explained that she had been clarified everything and that those earrings were actually a keepsake from her late mother. Now she couldn't accept them. Teo wasn't surprised that a gift like this made her uncomfortable enough already. He first accepted them, and now Teo apologizes for the inconvenience caused, but still asks Yuna to keep them. But the protagonist exclaims that she can't wear them. The dark-haired man jumped when the young woman suddenly approached and looked him straight in the eyes. She explained to him that she simply doesn't have her ears pierced. Turns out Yuna only has a mole on her earlobe. To wear those jewels, the protagonist needs to get her ears pierced first, but she can't do it alone. But she's eager to show off those rubies as soon as possible. So she asked her husband in a pleading voice if he would help her. The Archduke of the North asked again if she was sure, and she nodded after all. She always wanted to wear earrings. Right here was where Dad left a mark, like a sting, but it was actually a red mark on the body of the saint. The protagonist told the man enthusiastically that she asked him because she really trusted him. He touched her chin and told her he was going to start. Teo was so close it made Yuna blush. It must hurt a little, but the hero promised to do it as quickly as possible, and Yuna just had to hold on a bit. He brought the needle closer to her ear. The protagonist closed her eyes tightly. Feeling the pain, she started to bleed, and Teo immediately stopped asking the young woman with concern if she was okay. She got up abruptly, deciding to call the doctor anyway. But Yuna, with a smile, remembered that she still needed to pierce the other ear, and that she could try. However, Teo decided to take care of that task himself. After a while, everything was ready and perfect. The protagonist put on the earrings and asked for his opinion, and he spellbound said they were beautiful. Suddenly his eyes widened. In that instant, the memory of his mother hit him hard. It also revived that intense emotion he felt at that moment. Even though so much time had passed without caring about the heavy snowfall, he tried to shout to his mom with all his might. But his mother was already unconscious in the midst of the immense whiteness just before Karen rose, had promised her son that she would return soon, so the defense of their lands temporarily fell into his hands. She was more of a warrior than a ruler, but during a mission she died serving the empire, that great woman. She dedicated her life to dominating the north, and in the end she gave it up for the dukedom. Teo had to make sure her death wasn't in vain. To protect her legacy, he had to become stronger. Time passed, and in the end, the ruby earrings were the only thing reminding him that Karen Rose had lived there. Teo had never given it much importance, but now he was overwhelmed with pain, though it faded when he saw the new owner. The man wanted to confess to Yuna that he was happy she was his wife, but he chickened out and just thanked her. In reality, only her family called her that, so he was pleased that the Archduke was also calling her that. The man told her he didn't have nicknames, and everyone called him Teo, so she could too. The protagonist, of course, accepted that Teo would give her the family jewel. It surely meant he already saw her as his wife. In the blink of an eye, the pet names would come. and then they'd become mom and dad. However, in this recap manhwa, the protagonist knew there was still a long way to go, but that idea in his head made him smile. The next day, Yuna and Ray went out to the garden. It didn't freeze all year long thanks to the magic stones, so it needed constant weeding or it would be overrun with weeds. Yuna mentioned that rose flowers have a very sweet aroma. Maybe one day they can visit that place together, but